welcome to another video. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make this scene. And this scene is made from this circle. And then we're going to just use that circle over and over and over to create our scene. So this circle is the water. Then we expand to make the path. Then we expand to make the sand. Then we expand to make the grass and the rest of the soil. We use the same circle to create the hedge. We use the same circle to create all the trees. And if I go to the top view, we use the same circle for pretty much everything. Even the seats are matching the circle. The stones go in the same way. And also what I'm going to do is how to create this stone path using tyFlow. And then also if you look here, we have a sand effect that I'm going to show you how to do that, where it goes around the edges and it also goes around the stones. So let's jump straight into it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create our center circle. So go to create, go to our splines, and we're going to go to circle. Then I'm going to make sure snap is on and shift right click and make sure grid point is on. And then I'm going to click and grab until I get to around here, right click and go into modify. Now the pool itself, I don't want a radius of 14 meters. I'm going to go to a radius of maybe 5 meters. And then this is going to be our base main shape. So once we have this base main shape, we're going to build everything in our scene off this. So I'm always going to copy it and click OK. And the very first thing we're going to do is I'm going to add in a sweep modifier. And this is going to be the path around it. So straight away we have our sweep. Obviously we don't want it like that. We want to change this to bar. And we want to change a few things now. So I want the alignment to be at the very top because I want that to be pushed down. Going down here, if we change the length, you'll see that go up and down. So really it's the depth, but let's change this to something very small, something around 0.1 will probably do it. So now that I've got the length, let's change the width. Now the width itself, if I start changing this, you'll see it's going from the center there, but which we don't want. So we need to change the pivot to top corner and you see that switches to that edge of that spline. So this, we only want a short path. We want around 2.5 to 3 meters. So basically you want about 3 meters because you want two people to be able to walk abreast. That's how I deal with paths anyway. So we have a wooden path. Now we need to make the sand. So the great thing about our base shape we have here is we know this is 5 meters over here and we know this is 3 meters. So all I need to do is duplicate this, copy, and change this to 8 meters. And that will perfectly sit around. Now if you look in, it's a bit off and that's because of the resolution. We have these steps. So if I was to change that to something like 25, that's a lot smoother and we're hitting that edge perfectly. So now let's create the sand. We're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to add on a sweep modifier. And I see we have our sand right there, but we'll do 0.1 for now. And then we're going to change this to, instead of 6 meters, we're going to do 5 meters. And that's going to be our sand. Now with the sand, I only want one plane. So I'm going to isolate that, put an edit poly on top. And then I'm going to hit 4 to go into poly mode. Double click here. So if I hit F4, you'll see that. And click and double click. It's going to select all those, hit delete, select the bottom ones by double clicking. Oh, select the inside ones first. Hit delete and then select the bottom ones and hit delete. So now I just have that top plane. Now I'm going to unisolate and I'm going to change the color so you can see that a bit better. Any color will do. So we have our pond in the middle. We have our path here. We have our sand. And now the next thing is to create the landscape outside, which would be just the basic grass. We're going to create our lawn surface now. So I'm going to duplicate this base shape we've done all the time. I'm going to change this to lawn surface. And we know this is 3 meters. I think this is 6. So that's 9 meters added up to 5, which is 14 meters. So click this, go to 14. Oh, no, 13 meters. Yeah, there we go. I must have miscalculated. And what we're going to do is, again, increase this to something like, we'll go 50, just so it's nice and smooth around those edges. So now, exact same thing. We're going to add a sweep modifier onto it. We have our thing, but this time I'm going to make this quite large. So I'm going to make something like, let's go 40 meters, just so we have enough to cover our entire surface and we don't see anything beyond the camera. So we're going to do similar what we did here is I'm going to add on an edit poly. Let's isolate it. And I'm isolating by hitting Alt Q. Then I'm going to hit 4 and we're doing the exact same thing, which is I'm deleting all those. I'm deleting all the inside ones, delete, and then deleting the bottom. And then we're just left with the top surface. So we've pretty much built all the surfaces now. We have the pond in the middle. We have the path going along the pond. We have the sand here, and then we have the surface going here. So let's set up our camera now. So I'm going to go in here, make sure my render layer is selected, go into create, go into cameras, drop down to V-Ray and go V-Ray physical camera. I'm just going to drag it on anywhere. And what I usually do with my cameras is I usually zero them out in every axis. So right click here, go to my target. They seem to be all zero, so that's good. And then I'm going to select my camera and pull this back. And I want the shot to be around here. We're entering into this path. So I don't want to be super accurate at the moment. I might change it later. Select here, hit camera and go top view here. And I'm going to just move my camera up just so we have some kind of angle. And I'm going to change some settings in my camera. So first of all, go into settings, go into my focal length. It's outdoors. I usually go something like 28 millimeter lens, or I would go 24. For this one, I think I'm going to stay with 28. And then down here, when I'm outdoors, I usually increase this to 16, and we'll put this to 100 for the moment. So 100. And we'll look at that render later when we set up some lighting. For lighting, we're going to add in a HDRI. Just from here, I'm going to export day 30, nice and bright. And that's automatically going to set up our lighting and our dome light, and the light's coming from this direction. So once the light is added, let's render our scene and see what it looks like. And as you can see, it looks like crap, but don't worry, we're just setting up it now. So we have our pond here, we have our wooden floor here, we have our sand. We possibly will push this camera back, but now let's add a few materials so this looks a bit more like what we want. So now we're going to create the water, and it's very easy. Just click your object, hit M, right click here, go to materials, V-Ray, and go to your standard material. Then we have a bunch of presets up here. Select this and just go all the way to the bottom and click water. And I usually pump this up to 100. Okay, and then we have our water effect. Now to make this a bit better, what you can do is you can go into bump, select here, go into general and add in a bit of noise. Now we need to change this to make it look like water. At the moment you see there, it's a bit too strong. It's supposed to be a calm pond. So we're going to click in here. We're going to change a few things. So first of all, let's change this now, not the full black. We'll go to something like 30, 30, and 30 and click OK. Then I'm going to change the size of this to something like, maybe make it a bit bigger, 2. Yeah, that works. And the high one, we want to go to 0.55 and maybe 0.2. And then the very last thing is I'm going to go enable color map, right click here, bezier corner, and we're just going to make it a tiny bit darker, a bit more contrast. So then if I look at my water, that's looking a tiny bit better. We'll see if it's too strong. And also let's name our material, M_pond, not pound, pond. And we're going to go in here and we're going to apply this to our surface. So now let's add wood to our planks part here. So go back up here, go into our wood and laminate, and we're going to pick something like this. Right click and go to, actually before I do that, I want to make sure this isn't checked. And right click, then go to apply material to selected objects. And as you can see, we have that object. If I go up here, go materials, and go shaded materials with map so we can see it. Now, the great thing about a sweep, which I love and I've probably shown before, is it has this generate mapping coordinates. Once I click that, you'll see that the mapping coordinates follow that path, which is great. But I don't want these wooden planks going around in a circle like that. So there's two things you can do. You can either change the texture themselves, or sorry, the material itself, or the texture is going into it, or you can go in here and you can go UVW and go to UV X form. Once I'm in here, I'm going to go down to rotate and click 90. And now we have all our wood pointing out in the correct direction. So the next thing we need to do is we need to add in the sand. So I'm going to go into my material texture loader and I'm going to load this up. Hit load textures and we're going to select the sand that we want, which is here. And then we're going to make sure this is all right. I want the displacement. Everything seems okay. And now I'm going to go into this. I'm going to go real world and I'm going to say around 4 meters. And if it doesn't work, we can always change it. I'm going to create this, go M_sand, and I'm going to click OK. Then I'm going to apply this to our selection. I'm going to use the displace. This is probably too much. So let's go about probably 0.15 would be 15 centimeters. Let's go a bit small. Let's go 0.1 for now and go to apply to selection. The same with the sand texture. I want to make sure I check this generate mapping coordinates and as well the real world map size. Now the next material we're going to make is for the surface here, and I'm using mega scans. And if I go up here, I'm going to load those in now. To hit load textures, I'm using these Again, I'm using displacement as well. And the great thing about this, it automatically adds displacement once you create a material. And again, I'm going to put this about 4 meters, create material, and I'm going to call this m_ground surface. And then we're going to click OK. Check our displacement, and 0.2 should be good, and hit apply to selection. Now, clicking generate mapping coordinates will be a bit strange. If I click that, you'll see it's going in perfect circles, which we don't need. So what I'll do is I won't check this, and we're going to change the material ourselves. And we're going to change a few things. So if you've seen this before, I've done this in other videos. We're going to select here, go to V-Ray. We're going to use a triplanar, wherever it is. Go down to T, triplanar. And then we're going to use mapping source. We're going to use a V-Ray randomizer. And the only thing we need to check is this setting here, and that's going to make it seamless. And it would have been seamless anyway, but we would have seen repetition. This will just make it a lot harder to see that repetition. So we're going to change this to 4 meters by 4. We're going to make sure the blur is 0. And everything else I think is okay. So now if I go into my camera and I hit render, and now our render is starting to make a bit of shape and form. So now we're going to focus on the pond itself, okay? So the very first thing we need to do is these pond boards or paddle boards, whichever way you want to call them. So I have my object here, a simple model, and then I have my pond here. So let's go into Forest Pro, click onto this spline, right click, go into modify, and let's name this. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to click plus here to add an object, and then I'm going to click the object here. So now what we can do is I'm going to hide that object, our models, and now you can see it's scattering those objects. I'm going to go to my distribution, and I'm going to increase this down so we have more of them. But you'll see an issue happening. As we increase these, you can see they're starting to collide with each other. So luckily, Forest Pro has something to fix this. So if you scroll down all the way to the bottom of distribution, we can hit collision enable, and you want to make sure that preview and viewport is there so you can see it. So now it's after creating 100% a circle around this, and make sure that it doesn't collide. Now you can increase and decrease this if you wanted to go more and more. I'm going to go for safety purposes around 125. Now it's up to you preference wise how many of these you want, but what I want is I only want a certain selection of these, like a path going from this section to this section. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go into create, go into splines, and I'm just going to create a spline where I don't want these. Then go back to our Forest Pro object, go into areas, add this spline, but we want to make this an exclude. So now with this pond, we only have steps going across this section, and that's exactly what we want. So now the next thing in the pond is I want to get this planting going around the edge. So let's do that next. So I'm going to duplicate the one we just made. Now we're going to delete this spline, but we're going to keep the one around here. We also need to do geometry. And what I'm going to do is delete this one. And for the moment, I'm going to add in this and call it a template. And we're going to decrease the size of these a bit, just so we can see a bit better. And just so you get the idea of what I'm doing. So the next thing you want to do is you want to go to areas, go down here. And what I'm going to do is first of all, check this to edge. And then down here, I'm going to check this to density. Now, if I start increasing this, you'll see something happen, which is the outside will start going in. So it'll start excluding plants based on the out, in, and I obviously want the opposite of that. So if I change this to say 5 meters, I'm then going to go to edit curve, and we need to do the opposite. So I'm going to grab this, bring it down to 0. I'm going to grab this one and bring this up to 100. Okay. And then we can start going include, and you'll see that has the opposite effect, which is exactly what we want. So we can do around 2.5 meters. And now we have planting coming in from that edge. So now I'm going to go in and select some planting to replace those objects. Now I've gone in and added those planting. And one thing you're going to notice straight away is this planting is now intersecting with these boards, which I don't want. And it's a very quick solution. Again, go to areas. And here we have add forest per object. Click that. And we can click here, and now they won't intersect. Now the display might show a tiny bit intersection. You can always increase this. You also can change this to, instead of sphere, to mesh, and that will make it a bit more accurate. And you can also increase the resolution to like 2048, and that'll make it a bit better. But for this case, it'll work perfectly. So the next thing I want to do is I want to add denser foliage around these. So sometimes the water might gather in clumps around these objects, and that's what I want to create. So let's do that. So we're going to duplicate this forest per object. For this planting, I don't want to have this density on. I'm just going to keep it full like that, but I definitely want to keep that exclusion on these still. Now I'm going to change this to a different type of planting, and I'm going to jump straight back. So I've loaded in different plants, and for this one, I'm going to change the distribution. I'm going to say something like patches, and then we're going to change this to something we like a bit more. And then also I'm going to make sure that we have those added in. We do have the board added in, but maybe we need to increase the scale of these so we really don't have those gathering in. Now, if I select this, I just want to make sure this is on edge, and let's just hit render and see what it looks like. So it looks pretty good. The only thing is the density is probably a bit too much. So we'll decrease density, and then I'm pretty happy out of how this is looking. So in distribution, we want to go in here, and 10 is definitely too much on this one. Maybe we'll go up, try on that amount. Let's go 25. And then in the other forest project, in the same distribution, we want to change this. So we'll increase these so it's not as dense. And we actually, in areas, I'm going to switch back on the density fall off. So I want to decrease the ones on the outside a bit. So something like that. And the very last thing I want to do is distribution. And I'm actually going to change this to clusters. So you can only do this when you have two plants together. And I'm going to decrease this to about 5 meters. And maybe actually distribution needs to be a bit higher than that. So let's go to around 50. And then, yeah, so now we get clumps of plants together. And I think that's going to give us a much stronger look. So the next thing will be to add these very, very simple benches in just on the edge. So let's do that very quickly. And it's using the sweep modifier like I've used for everything else. So we can grab the pond, we can duplicate it, and we'll just call this benches for now and click OK. Then we can delete these and we have our circle. Now, if I isolate that, what we need is we only need a certain section. So I'm going to make the benches something along here. So I'm going to make sure it's an edible spline. I'm going to go into vertex mode and I'm going to go to refine. So I only want a bench around here and here. Right click, and we're going to select the segments and delete the ones we do not care about. So we just have this. So again, we're going to add a sweep modifier, and this time we're going to add in, let's go for, I think it was a T. So that's the one I used. Now we need to change a few things. Obviously we don't want this giant bench. So first of all, change the pivot to the center at the bottom. I'm going to go in here as well, and I'm going to remove the material because it has the pond material still on it. So it's definitely not 12 meters. Let's bring this down, and its seat's usually about 0.45. So that's 45 centimeters high. Looks a bit strange, I know. Give me a second, and let's just start changing this to about, let's go 2 meters. Thickness 0.02, if that makes sense, and 0.02. And then, yeah, we get something along that lines. Obviously, this is still too much. Let's go 1 meter. And now we have a bench like that. And pretty good. It's sunk in a bit into the ground, but I'm perfectly fine with that. But now, since this is pivots in the center, all we need to do now is go into our rotate tool, and then that way it will snap in that way. And I can hit 180 degrees, and we have one exact opposite side. And I want to make sure this is an instance, because there's going to be any edits I do to this, we'll edit this and click OK. And as simple as that, we have our two benches. Okay, so the very next thing moving out is there going to be these stones going around the perimeter. So let's jump straight onto that. So I've created this spline, and it's simply taken from the edge of this, and then it's adding on points down here, and this is where our path's going to be. So again, we're going to go into our forest per object. Let's turn on our other forest projects and highlight this, hit FP, select our spline, right click, and jump into the modify panel. So I'm adding in this preset, all rocks the same size, and I'm hitting load selected. Once that's loaded in, we need to change the distribution mode. Go into distribution, change this to path, click the plus button and click in your path. And straight away, you'll see your stones pop in. If I want, you can go to display and change this to point cloud. Back in distribution, we want to change this spacing. So I want it pretty close. So let's try 0.1 to start, 0.2, 0.3, and we keep going up until we find something we're happy with. So that's pretty good. 0.25 is probably the best. We can change the random position very slightly. So 0.02, just ever so slightly. That's how easy it is just to add those stones in along the edge. If you want yourself, you could add stones in around this edge by just adding another spline. You can add them in along this edge, but for this moment, I'm just going to leave them here. So working our way out, if I go back to this image here, we're going to now add in this stone path. And the way we did that was using tyFlow. So let's jump straight into that. So this is a simple primitive shape. I've just put it in here where I want the stones to show up. And down here I have tyFlow. If you don't have tyFlow, you can go into the website, just Google it, and you can download and install it for free. The only difference between the free and paid version is you only use one thread and it's a lot slower, but it works perfectly. So you can get it for free. So once I click here, I can drag it on and I have our object. So once you have the tyFlow object on, go to your modify panel and click open editor. I'm going to make this a bit smaller so you can see a bit better. And the first thing we're going to do is birth objects and drag this in. Now we need to pick the object we're going to be choosing, which is this. And then we can hide our tyFlow, our original object. So now we have this object to look at. Now, the first thing I want to do is make sure this is selected, hit tab and type in Voronoi fracture. I think that's how you say it, and click it. And it's in. And now you'll see this fracture look that I have in my render. So it's like, okay, great. There's a few settings you can change. If I increase the points, that'll just increase the amount you see. I think 10 or 15 is a good number. And then what we can do is we can go down here and in separation, we can start increasing this and this will start separating our objects. Now I'm going to go for something small like 0.06. So that's 6 centimeters. And we get something like that. Now I mightn't do it here, but what you can do is you can add another one on, make sure it's at the bottom underneath it, and it will add in even more. So let me go up to the top and we could decrease this down so we don't have as many, something like 2, maybe hit 2. And then we just add in a bit more and you can go down here and you can increase this again. So let's go 0.06 and we get even more detail. And if you get pieces that are a bit too small, you can go up to here and enable culling, and anything too small will get eliminated in case you're having that issue. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to delete this one as well. And I'm just going to stick with this one. But the tyFlow has a lot of options like this, and I suggest you deep dive into it. And I'll probably do more videos in the future about it. So one thing we have to do is, this isn't an actual mesh. So if I open this back up, if I unhide display, we can't actually see it. So since we can't see it, what we need to do is go down here, go to tyFlow, go tyMesher, drag that in, right click, and then we need to pick our object, which is, the tyFlow here. And what we want to make sure it's not a blob mesh, we want to do import mesh, and then we have our perfect topology. So now that I have this object, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit down here, extract mesh, and I'm happy with that. And I can pop this mesh into my geo, and then I can hide the tyFlow objects. And now we have our object, and we're going to bring this down just so it's penetrating the ground just enough. Then we're going to go in here and we're going to go to stone, this down here, and I'm going to click and drag this on there. So now we have our fractured path. We have everything in between. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to create that raked. Okay, so now we're going to do this sand effect you see going around these rocks and going along like this. It's relatively easy, so let's jump into it. So we have our sand texture here and we have a V-Ray displacement mod on it. And I've created a gradient map here. You can follow the same settings I have, and I have this set to 30 by 30. I have a bit of noise added in, and the way the gradient is done is like this. So we have a black here and we have white on both edges. So it will dip here and rise on the white. So once I do that, I'm going to plug this into here and click OK. I also then want to, for more control, I want to plug this into this texture into its displacement. Now let's hit render and see what that looks like. So you can see it has that effect of that raked effect, but obviously this is a bit too strong. So first of all, down here, I'm going to change this to something like 0.02 for 2 centimeters. And then we get more of a subtle look and it's not as strong. So now I've added in the rocks and you can see we have the rake detail now, but we need to add the rake detail to go around these rocks. In my scene, I have these splines set up and I'm just using the extrude modifier to penetrate through that ground. I can go to my modify here. I'm going to select this, which is, if you go to maps, V-Ray, and it's a distance texture map. I'm going to click this. I'm going to add in this object. Now, once that's added in, I need to change a few things. This is going to be our distance, the width of it is. So I'm going to do like 0.04, and that's going to be our width. And I need to swap these two colors, I believe. So I'm going to plug this now into our texture map here and click OK into our displacement mod. And then what I'm going to do is I'm also going to plug this straight into our displacement. And as you can see, you get this really cool raked effect, but we're now missing the other effect. So we now need to blend these two together in order to get both raked effects. So what's the best way to blend these? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click, Maps, General, I'm going to create an output node. And then I'm also going to right click, Maps, General, and we're going to grab a mix map. So the first one, which is our bumps for the overall texture, we're going to plug that into color 1. Then our distance text, we're going to plug into color 2, and then we're going to plug this into the output. And we're basically going to use this output to create a mask. Unfortunately, I can't see the preview. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. At the moment, it's not, but you kind of have to trust me. What we're doing is we're kind of clamping the colors and we're creating a mask from this V-Ray distance texture. And then we can use that for the mix amount. So now we have our new displacement. So first thing is plug it into here into the displacement, and then plug it into our V-Ray mod displacement mod here and click OK. As you can see, we get that result. So we have the raked effect along here, and we have the circular pattern here around the stones. So we get this really cool look with what was relatively easy. So the next thing we're going to do now is we're going to add in the lawn grass, we're going to add in the hedge, and we're going to add in the trees because they're all kind of rinse and repeat of each other. So let's jump straight into that. So the lawn's relatively easy. Just go to our Forest Pro object, click the surface, right click, and go into our modify panel. We're going to go into our Forest Pro presets. We're going to go into layered lawns, and we're going to go down and select this one here. Click load selected, and it's as easy as that. The next thing to create is the hedge going around. So I have this spline just created like we did the other video. Click here, right click, and go into our Forest Pro library. So click library, go down to hedges, cut hedges, and we're going to pick something that's relatively low. So something around 1 meter would be fine. Hit load selected, and that's pretty much it. Now we're going to use the same spline that we used for the hedge to create our trees. So go into Forest Pro object, isolate that spline, click, and let's pick some trees for our scene. Once they're loaded in, we need to change a few settings. So first of all, let's go to areas, and down here we'll go force open spline, and there's a few other things we need to change. Display, let's change the point cloud so we have a bit of idea what's going on. I want to go back to areas then, and this 10 meters we want to reduce. So I just want it around here. And then also what we need to do is we need to go to our transform and just change these so they're not all the exact same. And just like that, we have our hedge, we have everything. Now the final thing we need to do is we need to add in these circular planter beds. And then finally, we can add in this ring and these models, and that'll be the scene done. So creating those circular planter beds, we're going to do exactly what we did throughout this entire video. Is I'm going to duplicate this same spline by holding down shift and dragging. I'm going to delete all these, and we're going to pick a size that kind of suits this. So probably something like, 2.75 seems good. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert this to an editable spline, and then I'm going to change the pivot. So effect pivot, I'm going to make sure grid snaps is on, hit snap and drag this down here, undo that. And then I'm going to rotate this while holding shift. Okay, I'm going to cancel there. And I'm going to rotate this till it's 40 degrees. And then, not 45, rotate this 40. And then I believe if I do 8 or 9, it should be a perfect circle. Yep, there we go. And now we just need to create flower beds for this. So I've done exactly what I've done before. I added the Forest Pro object by clicking onto this Forest Pro here and clicking onto these splines, and then I just populated with plants. Nothing new there. And the only other thing I want to do is with these splines here, the flower beds, I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm just going to call them flower beds, not the spline. So flower beds, click OK, go in here, and we'll use our classic, make sure actually this is unique, and then I'm going to put this as a sweep like we've been using the whole time. Click there, and what we need to do is, first of all, I'm going to remove the materials for now. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to bar just like we had. Change this to probably about 0.2. Make sure the pivot is at the bottom center, even the bottom outside. And the width here, I want to be very small, like 0.04 maybe. And that's just to create those planter beds there. And then I'm just going to add a simple material, just some metal. Yeah, something like metallic bronze. And go add selected objects. And then we have our material. So if I go here, the very last thing I want to do is I want to add in this ring. And then we just have our 2 boxes here. So creating the ring is very similar to what we did. I'm going to copy this, which is the pond in the middle, and click OK. We're going to drag this down somewhere in position. Let's look at our camera so we can see this, and we're going to rotate this 90 degrees. I'm also going to make sure the material is gone. And I'm going to delete all this, and we're going to put our trusty friend, the sweep modifier, on. And now I'm going to change the thickness of this. So we don't want that. We want something like 0.1. And obviously the size of this is a bit too much. So we want something like, again, something small enough, 0.04. And the overall size of this is way too much. So we need to change this down until we get something we like. Move it up around that size and then move it up. And again, this is just what you feel looks best. I'm going to, again, go into my effect pivot. I'm going to put snap on, push this up, and then I'm going to rotate with shift selected 180 degrees. So it's on the exact opposite side, make it an instance and click OK. And then we'll select both of these, and I'm going to use the same material I used on the flower beds. I click here, apply to selected objects. So I made a few changes. I've pushed this a bit closer away, or I should say further away from the camera, so I can add in these models, which I get from Arch Models. You can insert any one you want. And now we're pretty much done. There's only one thing I want to change, which is if I hit render, you can see that I do kind of like the lighting. I don't want to change it too much, but it's completely horizontal. And it's kind of looking a bit odd with that line coming right across the path and the shadows hitting us there. So I'm going to change the light a tiny bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here, select my light source, and I'm going to go lock texture icon, select my light, and I'm just going to rotate it so the light comes at us a bit more, but we still see some of those shadows. I also kind of want to move this camera a bit because it's a bit too, I don't like how it's chopping off the top of that. So after a bit of tweaking, this is what I've come up with. I raised up the shot a bit. I've also added in a light in the background to come in here, and it's at the brightening it up. And this is pretty much our scene. I'm going to go into our settings. I'm going to make sure these textures are working. I think that's just because it's IPR. Good, hit render, save it out, and we'll just look at it in Photoshop and see what we can do to add a few more tweaks. Okay, so I've brought in the final render into Photoshop. I've done a few things just beforehand. I just wanted to test it out. And what I've done is I've added in this circle. If I click select, anything outside this, I've added in a bit of desaturation. And I've also changed this to light and color just to draw the eye into that centerpiece more. And we don't care about the colors out here. Then I've also done this, and I brought in the saturation in the middle slightly up. And then finally, all I did was add a bit of curves. These are macro details. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to merge all the layers. So Control, Shift, Alt, and E to merge all those layers up here. And now we're going to hit Control, Shift, A, and that's going to open up our camera raw. And this allows us to do macro details, so bigger changes very quickly. So I like using this. So I'm going to go to exposure and see what we can do. Maybe crank it up a tiny bit, and contrast, bring that up. And we're just going to start changing things. And usually what I do is I go extreme one and decide if I want to go one or the other. So highlights, I probably want more highlights. Shadows, I go back and forth, and I probably want to increase these. And this is only a JPEG, so we're not going to get that much detail out of it. If you're using a higher bit rate render, then it would actually, you'd have to be able to use this with more control. But it's okay, we get a lot out of this, and it's very powerful. So the whites you can bring up, make it bounce off this stone. The blacks you might want to bring down, I say, because we don't want to whitewash it completely. Then texture, we can zoom in here and see what it does. Bring this all the way up, and you can see it really pumps up those textures. So not too much. And then clarity is quite similar. You can get really sharp, fine details. It really depends what look you're after. See, you can go like down and make that hazy look. good for halos. And then if you want, I'm going to bring this up a tiny bit like that. And then dehaze again, those kind of similar things, depends what you're looking for. I'll bring it up a tiny bit. And the very last thing is you can go into detail if you want, and you can bring in sharpening a tiny bit and noise reduction. And then you can also go, if you have optics, if it's actually taken with the camera, you can actually fix that. And that's pretty much what we want to do with this image. And now we've got a much more different look and feel. Now we can do more refinement in Photoshop. So just click OK and submit that. Now, the one thing about those edits is it's a global edit. So a lot of things have gotten a bit too saturated. So you can see these plants are a bit too extreme in the saturation end. So I'm going to select these, go back here, and then I'm going to use saturation, and I'm just going to kill the saturation in them a bit. So if I go all the way down, there'll be no color. So bring it down slightly. I also need to add in these plants too. They seem to be just separate elements, something like that. And then add them into this. So if I hit Alt and backspace, it'll fill that in. So again, that's too extreme. So bring it up. I just want to kill it a tiny bit, make it a bit brighter because the sun's hitting it. And yeah, that seems pretty good. Now, say you pick these trees here and you actually don't like the color of them. There's a simple thing you can do in Photoshop, which is I go to my render IDs, I select those, and then we can add another hue and saturation. I can hit colorize down here, and then you can see those have changed. And now I can just slide this hue and I can bring that across, and there straight away we have trees that are green. So perfect. Like, that's something quickly you can do. You can also, if you want, bring this down and give it slightly that more autumn look. So now you have something in between the red and the green. So we can do something like that. It's totally up to you what you want. The next thing I want to look at is this wooden platform. It's a bit too red and it didn't have enough contrast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the wood. I'm going to go into my adjustments, go to levels. I'm going to increase the contrast. Oh, a good bit there. Oh, excuse me, I need to move this down and on that. And then you can see as I move that up, we get a bit more contrast, but the reds are a bit too strong then. So move this up a bit, then drop this menu down, go to the reds and push this down. So, up. So we get that kind of look. So now we get more of a slightly browner look, which is what I want. And I think it looks better in the image overall if I was to zoom out. So we get, instead of that kind of too bright look, we get this, which is a bit of dampness. Maybe it's a bit too strong. You can bring this down. You could also change this if you want more contrast. You can do like an overlay. So you get that brightness still there, but you get that slightly more brown look. And for me, I'm going to keep it on multiply, I think, and then just use the opacity to decide how much I want to put it on. So just like that, we completely change the wood look and we get a different look altogether. So using textures in your work is pretty helpful to do in Photoshop. Photoshop does a pretty good job at this. So I've just grabbed this texture here and I've created this mask just from our tiles here. So what you want to do is grab this texture, hit Control T to go into transform, right click and go to distort. So now I'm going to bring this edge to here. I'm going to bring this edge to here, and those edges up there are fine where they are. Now, in order to use this texture, you can change a few things. So multiply is a good option, but as you can see, multiply, the blacks are going to be too strong. So we need to invert this because we want the opposite. We want, if I isolate this layer, we want the blacks to be seen and the whites not. Now, obviously this is way too strong. So what you do is you'd bring this down to an opacity much lower and you get that kind of effect. Again, you don't want this on everything. So what you do is you'd add a mask on top of that, hit B, and you'd start painting out areas that are just a bit too strong. So especially up here where you shouldn't see as much, maybe there. And just like that, you have a totally different look with just a simple texture on top. So similar to what I did with the path, I've done with the boulder. If I isolate this and isolate this layer, you can see I have a texture here, which is just a bit of noise, like so. Bring that back down and bring it back. And then I've just added a bit of color. And this one, instead of multiply, I've used soft light. And you can go through these. These ones usually give you a bit more, excuse me, give you a bit more contrast. So you can see that contrast increase. You can go overlay if you want and get a different look like that. Now, the very last thing I like to do is I've merged my layers again. I go into filter, I go into lens correction, and I'm going to zoom in here so you can see a bit better. And if I go to custom and I change this cyan filter up here, you're going to see one thing. Let's make it a bit extreme so you can really see it. So you can see there's a red fringe going along here and there's a green fringe happening here, which is a camera error, which happens. So it's something that you might want to put into your images to give that bit of realism. Now this is a bit too strong, so I'm going to bring this down. And be aware when you're changing this, you will shift the camera. So if I go down like this, you'll see the camera actually shifts that image, so be aware of that. So I'm going to push it up a tiny bit. And then the one thing I'm going to do is if I zoom out, I'm going to add in a vignette, which makes sense definitely because it's kind of the circle here. I'm going to push this down, and then I want the gap to be maybe tighter, so it's not as much. So bring that up, and then I'm going to click OK, and that's pretty much our final image. So if I switch everything off here, and we can see what we started with was this image, which is quite dull, quite flat, and then with a few edits, we ended up with this. So don't be worried if your render comes out a bit flat. You can always bring it into Photoshop and just pump it up and get that actual image you're looking for. I hope the video has been helpful. There'll be plenty more of these to come, and subscribe if you want more. So thanks a lot for watching.